child will lose that sense of safety. So that is, then I'm going to turn it to Dr. Arfine to give us a little bit more around this topic.
Yeah, so thank you for sharing those thoughts. I think, starting the conversation with them, checking in with them, seeing what the information they know, and reassurance are kind of the key things that Dr. Oklaszki talked about. And then, really instilling the sense of security and safety that we do have in Canada, so that the fear doesn't trickle down to them. So thank you for sharing those points. I think one of the important things oftentimes that we do as parents is we talk a lot and we don't listen. I catch myself doing this a lot. I think that it's really important to hear where your kids are at with this. It's really important to hear what they know. And listening is a key ingredient to any parenting strategy. It's really to hear their experience of things, what they know and what they want to know. And sometimes parents really, they shy away from asking their kids, like, what do you want to know about this? And what questions do you have? And what worries do you have about this? And actually having just really open-ended conversations like that is the way to really establish a strong, close connection with your child, because they feel like they are safe, that they can talk to you about anything, and that you're not going to tell them things that are not the truth, right? They know when you're painting a prettier picture than what it is, right? They know when you might be giving them false information. And so really checking in with them about what they want to know and being as honest and transparent as you can be, without scaring them, without instilling a sense of fear in them. And that's hard, right? We have to acknowledge that that's hard when it comes from a place where us as parents, we're scared too. We're fearful too. And so that brings us to our next point of a really key ingredient of listening, and sharing your thoughts and feelings is also validating. And so validation, I know Imam Hindi will talk more about this as well, but validation is a key ingredient to that listening and that communication component, because validation allows a person to know that you know how they feel. And that's the key of validation. A lot of people validate and they think they're validating. So they'll say, you're mad and that's because your toy was taken away from you. And the thing is that that's your interpretation of what they're feeling. When you check in with your child and you say, how are you feeling? And they say, I'm mad or I'm upset. Reflecting that back to them to say, I hear that you're mad and that you're upset. Using their words back to them really means a lot for kids. It signals to them that you've heard what they're feeling. It signals to them that you're listening, and it signals to them that you understand and care. And so it's also not about encouraging them in that emotion. So if you think, hey, this isn't something to be angry or upset or emotional about, it's not putting your lens on it. It's not putting your spin on it. It's just hearing that that's where they're at. So that's a really important piece of listening, is to try not to jump in with our emotions, with our thoughts, and is to just sit in the moment and validate what it is that their experience has been. So that's another key piece. I wanted to ask Imam Hindi, though. I just wanted to check in if you wanted to talk a little bit about some other things that may have come up, and then we have some more tips to get to as well.
Yeah, I think, subhanAllah, I think you guys hit all the major notes. I'm a parent myself, and my eldest is around 10 years old now, and I had to speak to her about what happened in London, Ontario. And honestly, I had no idea how I was going to talk to her about it, but I just thought, let's just bring up the topic, tell her what took place, and then, just see what she says and what she wants answered. And I think that's, it's important for parents to just take that step, not feel too afraid about bringing these things up, not feel too afraid about sheltering them too much. We have to realize our kids are, they're here, they're in Canada, they're growing up in this atmosphere, and they're going to be exposed to these things, and they're going to hear about it. If you're not going to be the one to tell them, their friends are going to tell them, they're going to find out about it somewhere, they're going to hear you talking to your spouse about it, they're going to pick it up. And it's more important for us to address it with them directly, to be able to answer the questions that they might have, so that they don't catch, a snippet of information here and a snippet of information there, and maybe even think, worse about it than it actually is, and come to worse conclusions than we want them to get to, or that we expect that they might get to. So, it's really important to do that. And then, like both speakers mentioned, to validate their emotions and to say, like, it's fine if you feel angry. It's fine if you feel fearful. It's fine if you feel anxiety. It doesn't mean you're a bad Muslim. And I do think a lot of people sometimes shame people for feeling emotions too strongly. That we say, like, why are you feeling this sad about it? Like, why are you this fearful about it? And that's not right either, because, we're all going to go through our process, and definitely it's wrong. It's not good if we're stuck in emotion for a long period of time, stuck in grief, stuck in fear. But to feel it, particularly as these things took place and as they're taking place right now and in the moment, is absolutely natural. And we see in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions the prophets feeling different emotions like that. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَأَوْجَسَ فِي نَفْسِهِ خِيفَةَ مُوسَى. Allah talks about Prophet Musa, that he sensed within himself fear, right? So he's a prophet of Allah and he's receiving revelation, and in that moment, he feels a lot of fear. Allah mentions about Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, وَلَقَدْ نَعْلَمْ أَنَّكَ يَضِيقُ صَدْرُكَ بِمَا يَقُولُونَ. Allah says that we know that your chest feels constricted about what they are saying. Meaning the Prophet feels an anxiety and a grief and a sadness about what Quraysh is saying about him. So having these emotions is not wrong. It doesn't mean that you're a bad Muslim or anything like that. Being a good Muslim doesn't mean you're immune to feeling emotions. And so our children are going to feel these emotions, and to validate the fact that they have these emotions, to listen to their perspective, and just talking to them, actually enforces safety. Like, we're worried about taking away their feeling of safety, but when they get an opportunity to speak to us, to ask questions, by going through that process of talking to us and asking questions, it actually enforces their sense of safety, in a lot of cases, rather than, they just feel fear and they don't get the chance to talk to you about it. So, I think those are important things for us to do as parents. Just take that step, have those conversations. And I think if we do that, it will be easier for our kids to process their emotions through whatever it is that's taking place. And then, of course, there are so many different tools and things that we want to bring to our children when dealing with these types of situations, reminding them to do the dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I was reading about processing your emotions, and taking deep breaths is important. And taking deep breaths is important. I'm thinking about it, and like a lot of times when we do dhikr, it's like subhanallah, subhanallah, subhanallah. Like, we're going so fast, we're not breathing, we're not even saying the word fully. If we teach our kids, hey, when you feel stressed, take a few moments, say subhanallah, take a breath, subhanallah, think about what this word means, think about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If you feel some fear, make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Instilling this in our children is incredibly important, and it will give them a sense of mindfulness. It will give them a connectivity with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then, our kids are going to react to us as well. If we don't want our kids dwelling in fear, we have to as well show them that we're not too afraid. We're still going to the masjid. We're still presenting ourselves as Muslim. We're not going to, barricade ourselves in our homes. We're going to take a walk in our neighborhood. We're not going to succumb to the type of fear that those people want to put on us. And your kids see you doing that, then, they're going to take their cues, inshallah, from you as well.
And that's such a key point, Jazakallah khair, Imam Hindi. Those are such key points that you've brought up, especially, about modeling, and you touching on, that parenting and how impactful modeling is for kids, right? Because they do get all of their cues and their information from you. And so with that, I wanted to turn over to Dr. Al-Kawashki for some of the other tips about how this topic can be approached with children and things as well.
Thank you, Dr. Malik. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about your last point about modeling, because it's also important for parents to take care of themselves during this traumatic events or things that bother them, right? Or things that happen that are very negative for them in their lives. And it's important for the parents to also be able to get the support that they need in order to be like the models that they would want to be for their parents, for their kids. And then going back to so we talked about starting the conversation, we talked about the reassurance and instilling the sense of safety and listening and validating. So the next step would be the allowing them to process. And as part of allowing them to process, what has happened is, of course, listening to them and all of that. But in addition to that, we would want them to maintain like a healthy kind of routine that they're used to. They're, in order for them to be able to sleep well, in order for them to be like able to get nourishment and everything. And then also allowing them to think of ways to take action. So, because a lot of children would want to know, like, okay, so what can we do to help those people, let's say, that got affected, or to prevent things from happening. So depending, of course, on the child's age, but like, let's say for young children, they can write let's say, a letter to the affected family. They can make like prayers every night for this family, or like for the affected people. They can also, let's say, gather charity for them. So these are kind of some of the ideas that that can help children process and make them feel like they are also contributing to the healing of the people that got affected. Another thing that is important is to try to limit the media exposure that the children get, because we know very well that like media can be really, really intense, and we can't filter what media gives, like what messages media gives to our children or sends to our children. So trying to be very selective when we ourselves are watching the news, or being on social media, and what they can see at the same time. And trying to avoid the stereotyping of people who, just people in general, or people groups, because we know firsthand how that feels for us, because we are always stereotyped as a minority group, in addition to like other people of color. And children tend to, especially the younger ones, like below maybe 12, would tend to generalize that kind of information to the other people around them. And that's not something that we want as Muslims. These are not our values. So I'll turn it up to Dr. Malik to give us more.
So one of the things you touched on, Dr. Alkashki, that I wanted to clarify is talking about stereotyping, particularly, I'll spell it out, of, the narrative of a white person who may bring, or who may have afflicted harm on a Muslim community or a Muslim group, which, us as adults, sometimes we talk about that narrative because we've heard the opposite narrative for so long about Muslims being painted as terrorists, and, individuals who may be Caucasian or white being, painted as the lone wolf, or as people who may have mental health challenges, incorrectly painted in this way. And I think when we talk about these narratives, as Dr. Kawashki's touching on, it's that children pick up on what we're talking about around them, and they pick up on even us discussing this in a surface level way. And so really trying to avoid stereotyping white individuals in this manner is really important, especially for individuals who may, alhamdulillah, be in a community where they're surrounded by Muslims, right? Where maybe you're going to Islamic school, most of your friends and family are Muslims. You really don't want to instill that sense of fear and unsafety in your children, and to know that that this is, an individual just like any other individual of any other race. And I think that's really, really important. Another important tip that we really wanted to touch on is taking care of yourself as a parent means not just taking care of, what your children may know and ensuring that they're feeling okay. It actually means you feeling okay as well. And we have to each acknowledge, us sitting here, each of us are parents who are here, that we are scared. We are scared to a certain extent. We are scared about what things may be like for our children. We are scared about the world that we live in today. We are scared, that this happened, so close to home. And I think it's important to acknowledge that, so that you can then process, so that you can then know what's the narrative that you run in your mind about how you manage and how you cope. what are the things that allow you to continue your faith practices and draw you closer to Islam? Because the reality is that if we don't have a good understanding of how to cope and how to process, our children won't as well. And they'll hear that you're confused, and they'll hear that you really don't know. And so I think really having an internalized sense of understanding of what is it that happened and how is it that we can proceed forward. And I think with that, I want to turn over to Imam Hindi, because I think that the insights are really important for us as Muslim parents to really understand how we can cope and how we can understand these tragic events in the context of Islam.
Bismillah. I think, there's a few things that as parents we have to keep in mind as well. One of it is that I feel that this might be a little uncomfortable for people to really think about, but that we need to be aware that this is not the first attack that's happened against Muslims in Canada, and it's unfortunately probably not going to be the last one. We had this, attack in London, Ontario. We had the brother who was attacked and killed outside of the IMO Masjid in Toronto, and 4 years earlier, there's a Quebec City mosque. And between that, honestly, there have been lots of Muslim women in hijab who've been attacked different ways across Canada. So, these things are going to take place. And, sometimes we're so shocked when something like this happens that the shock becomes so intense that it shatters our iman, it shatters our belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it just kind of destroys us completely. And then there's, the other side of the spectrum where people just expect these things to happen to the point that they have now surrendered to them happening. They're just like, we're going to be abused and that's it. And we need to be in that middle path where we know these things are going to happen. We're not 100% totally shocked when they take place, because unfortunately that's the world that we live in right now. But at the same time, we are working against it, speaking against it, organizing against it, trying to, resist it however we can, and however Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows us to. So, that's something that's important as kind of a philosophical grounding for this, because Islamically, we know that difficulty, hardship in our lives is going to take place, right? The beautiful advice of Luqman to his son in the Quran, he tells him, "Aqim as-salah, ya bunayya aqim as-salah, wa'mur bil ma'ruf wanha 'anil munkar wasbir 'ala ma asabak." He tells him, establish your prayer, enjoin what is good, forbid what is evil, and be patient over what will afflict you. And the scholars say, look, he tells him, be patient over what will afflict him, i.e. afflictions, persecutions, hardships in life. These are to be expected by a believer. That if you believe in Allah, you pray, you establish your salah, you enjoin what's good, you stand up against what's evil and what is injustice, that doing these things is always going to put you in the line of fire, right? And the Prophet ﷺ mentioned that the people who are ashad al-nas bala'an al-anbiya, the people who are most tested in this world, who are persecuted the most, are the prophets. And then those who are after them, and then those who are after them, people are tested according to the strength of their iman. So in this life, we're going to be persecuted, we're going to be tested. And it's really, sometimes it's something that you have to go through to reach a better plane. The story of Khabbab ibn al-Arat, and I worry about going on too long because this could be a whole khutbah, subhanAllah, on its own. So please, stop me if I go on for too long. But Khabbab radiallahu anhu was a companion. He was a slave in Mecca and he was tortured. Like there's one story about Khabbab later on when Umar ibn Khattab is the Khalifa. This is after the Prophet's passed away. Islam has flourished at this point. And he sits with Umar and Umar tells him, tell me one thing your master used to do to you. So he didn't answer. He just lifted up his shirt and showed his back to Umar, and Umar began to cry, because all of his back was completely deformed from how much it had been burned during torture. This same Khabbab came to the Prophet one day. He said to the Prophet, will you not make dua for us? Will you not ask Allah for victory? And really what he's saying to the Prophet is, isn't it enough? Like, we've been through too much. Isn't this enough persecution that we've gone through? Every day we're being tortured. And so he's telling the Prophet, you're the Prophet. I've seen you make dua. Allah answers your dua right away. So isn't it time for you to make dua for this to be over, for us to get victory, for this persecution to end? And the Prophet actually got upset with Khabbab. And he said to him, other people have been persecuted. And he mentioned to him persecutions of other people in the past, other nations that received revelation, what happened to them, some, very gruesome persecutions that they went through. And then the Prophet said, in this affair, i.e. this religion is going to flourish and it's going to succeed, so much so, there will be so much safety that a woman will be able to travel between Hadramaut and Sana'a, two cities in Yemen. He said that she will be able to travel alone by herself, fearing nothing. Like she is in complete security, fearing nothing except maybe the dogs and the wolves along the path. And then the Prophet said, وَلَكِنَّكُمْ تَسْتَعْجِلُونَ, but you are being people who are being hasty. Meaning the Prophet is telling him, we as a community are in a position of weakness. We have to go through the struggle to come out to a higher plane, and then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give us the victory. And so they went more than a decade of persecution in Mecca before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala finally allowed them to achieve a type of victory in this world, and the religion to flourish, and the prediction of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam to come to pass. But this idea of realizing that, the sunnah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala means we're going to go through difficulties and hardships, and that's something we should be almost expecting to happen in our lives. And then also the idea that this world is not permanent, and therefore the hardships in this world is not permanent. There isn't a life after this world that is going to make this world seem insignificant. And at the same time, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, inna ma'al usri yusra, and سَيَجْعَلُ اللَّهُ بَعْدَ كُلِّ عُسْرٍ يُسْرًا. Allah mentions different verses in the Quran that with hardships, even in the time of hardship, you find ease. The ease might be the communities coming together. The ease might feel that you feel solidarity, that there's other non-Muslims who now see what's happening to us, and they feel more sympathy towards us, and they feel more solidarity towards us. So even in the moment of hardship, there is form of ease that sometimes we don't pay attention to. And Allah says after hardship comes ease as well, meaning the hardship that you're facing is also not permanent. It's going to end at some point in time. And so these are things that we have to keep in mind as well, to make sure that we're not feeling overwhelmed by fear, to make sure that we're not shutting down because of anxiety and fear and things like that. And that when we're able to feel that ourselves, inshallah, our children are going to feed off of that as well.
Jazakallah khair for that, Imam Hindi. And I think that those are such important concepts, the concept of, the lack of really the historical understanding of, how Muslims have really come to where we are right now. The historical context of what the Prophet ﷺ, the Sahaba have been through, and really framing it in a broader understanding that really it's beyond this world. It's beyond this worldly understanding of why events happen. And this being Friday, reflecting also on Surah Kahf, and really, the stories that come up in that surah, just reflecting on how there's so many things that we don't know, and that only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has wisdom and has an understanding of why certain events happen. And I think we need to humble ourselves to that, to us just not having that amount of knowledge. I wanted to also just talk a little bit about coping for parents in not only the spiritual dimension and the spiritual way of understanding, but how do we cope when overwhelming emotions come to us, right? And do we as parents sometimes need to step back and reflect about supports that we need, whether they are counseling supports, whether it is to talk with friends and family and have adult time to talk about these things, whether it is, knowing that you're feeling overwhelmed by the anxiety and that the emotions are lasting for a long time. As Imam Hindi, I think had mentioned about, emotions, and how emotions really, they are welcome in Islam. But what we do know is that when we have a persistent negative set of emotions that's impacting us in a really negative way in our ability to function, that really needs to be addressed, and that there are supports for that. And so if as parents we're noticing that within ourselves, our children are noticing that 1,000 times more. They may not say anything, but they notice and they pick up on subtle things like that. And so really taking a check-in for ourselves about what do we need in this moment? Are our emotions getting ahead of us? Is it really difficult for us to sleep? Are we having challenges in our relationships with others? And are we anxious, and are we fearful? And is it too hard for us to move forward? And so I really encourage parents to really keep an eye on that for themselves as well. I wanted to turn it over to Dr. Al-Kawashki for some of the remaining tips before we have 2 questions from the audience that I wanted to get to after we wrap up this segment of the question and answer period.
Thank you. So one of the last points that I think are very important is knowing that there is a normal response or normal responses. Like there's a spectrum of responses that children can have to tragic events. So Some children can respond by just isolating themselves. Some children can respond by becoming hypervigilant or just being afraid to separate from their parents. Some kids can be angry, frustrated, irritable, like maybe throwing tantrums when they stopped for a while. And if this is kind of not lasting for a long time, and the child just needed that kind of response to help them process what's going on, what they would need is the support of the parents. But then if that lasted longer than, let's say, 4 weeks, then we would recommend that the child be just assessed, and to know that, to just make sure that they're not suffering from, let's say, a post-traumatic stress disorder. So especially if they were close to the tragic event, or in a situation that exposed them like more closely to that event. And it's important to also know if your child is, let's say, at risk of having more severe kind of responses. Let's say if the child himself or herself is a sensitive child by temperament, or is a child that, let's say, went through trauma in their early childhood, or is in a household that had trauma too. And then also, if the child themselves is a refugee or is an immigrant that had a very rough childhood. So those kids would be more at risk of having challenging responses if such a tragedy occurs. Dr. Malik, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to this point.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that sometimes these traumatic events, the way that we know trauma works is that it builds upon each other. And what happens is when you experience a traumatic event in your life, and then you experience another traumatic event, it brings back the memories from the initial trauma, because your body feels the same things and your mind feels the same things. They don't feel safe. And so that feeling of not feeling safe and not feeling secure causes the same reactions to happen. And you can notice that a kid, or even a parent, and I really want us to reflect even as parents about, is this what is brought up for us a lot of the times? If we have been through traumatic events, if we have been through experiences that have been really challenging, does this bring up the emotions from the past, the way that our mind was processing things in the past? And the important things to notice about that, as Dr. Elkowashki said, is that sometimes we can experience that flood of emotions that comes after a traumatic event, that shock that Imam Hindi is talking about. And that lasts for a few days, and that can be quite normative, right? It can be quite normal for this very traumatic event to bring back memories of another traumatic event that happened. But if this lasts for a significant period of time, obviously we have these arbitrary cutoffs of 4 weeks, but really what we're saying is a prolonged period of time. It's a prolonged period of time where it's impacting your work, it's impacting your relationship with your children, your relationship with your spouse. Then you know that you need some more supports, right? And what we're really talking about is it's bringing up too much trauma for you, and you need some help processing, and you need some support. The other really important piece that I think we kind of touched on briefly is just about advocacy, right? So I think Imam Hindi was really touching on, how do we not become that resigned, population who says, okay, sabr, like we just need patience and all of this will pass. That piece that we need to instill also in our children about advocacy, and how advocacy can be done positively, and how we can actually look to the other groups in Canada, such as the Black, Canadians, as well as the Indigenous groups, as well as many other groups who actually face significant racism and discrimination and persecution on a daily basis, and how we can actually advocate for their needs and their rights, and how important that is for us to be allies with one another in this fight against discrimination and oppression, because really Islam is about freedom from oppression for all and justice for all. And so instilling these ways of us being good and this goodness in our children actually allows these to be opportunities for us to teach our children, and trying to make any good of what we can from this tragic situation. So I just wanted to highlight some of those points. I'll check in with Imam Hindi and Dr. Al-Kawashki if there's anything else to add on this, and also with the audience if they have any further questions about should we talk to our children about this tragic event, how should we talk about this tragic event, and then we'll move on to the other questions that we have waiting for us. Anything else to add? Okay. So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, I'm reading through some of the other questions, and I just want us all to even take a deep breath, because even talking about this is heavy. I feel heaviness just having talked about, what each of us are going through right now. And so I just wanted to take some time for us to switch our hats a bit, to talk a little bit about prophetic parenting. And so one of the questions that comes to us is, how do we prepare our children for the Western society that they will experience here and not lose their values? So maybe I'll open it up to Imam Hindi and Dr. Al-Kawashki. I'll read it again. How do we prepare our children for the Western society that they will experience here and not lose their values?
Imam Hindi, you can go first.
So I think, this is a broad question, and one that I think all of us grapple with all the time. The fact is we're a minority, and our beliefs and even our morals at times are not going to be part of what dominant society considers to be right at any given point in time. And I think what's really important is for you to build your home as a safe space for your children to learn about their deen. I've probably said this a number of times, but I've just seen this so often, is that people think educating their children about their religion is dropping their kids off for an hour on the weekend at the masjid and be like, go memorize some Quran. And they'll memorize like a few surahs from Juz Amma, and then that's it. Like, that's all they know. And maybe they want them to learn, the rules of prayer and how to make ghusl and how to make wudu, just kind of like the functional parts of being a Muslim. But they don't really teach them and answer their questions in relation to deeper philosophical questions, like, why am I supposed to pray to begin with? Why does Allah want me to believe in Him? Why, how do I know that God exists? All these very important foundational questions aren't answered. And I think even from when our kids are young, we need to be teaching them foundational questions, right? Who is Allah? What are the attributes of Allah? What are how do we connect to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Who's the messenger of Allah? And really having them build an emotional, deeper, intellectual connection to our tradition. And it's really important to do this from a young age, because we used to tell parents, look, once your kids go off to university, they're going to be exposed to like 100 different views on every single issue. And, you need to make sure that they have a foundational understanding of Islam before they go to university. That's what we used to say. Now kids are 14, 13 years old even. They might be on their cell phones, going on YouTube, watching a bunch of videos about Islam, some of them by very anti-Muslim people. So they're being exposed to more things at a younger age. And it's really, really important that we build in our children this foundational knowledge of Islam. I work for Yaqeen Institute. There are a number of resources that we have that can be used by parents or teachers. We have conviction circles, which takes a number of these types of important questions and delves into it deeper. There's also Yaqeen conversations about how to have conversations with your friends or with your children on some of these important, faith-related questions. So I think those things are really important to help prepare the child from an earlier age. It's also important to build with them a support system, so friends that have a similar mindset, your family friends, your family, that they all are trying to achieve the same thing, to instill Islam in them from a young age. So if they have that support system of friends that they grow up with from a younger age that all are being raised similarly, that's really important as well. So even you yourself, who are you bringing into your social circle? Who are the people that you're getting to befriend? Do they have the same values and the same morals that you have, that you want your children to have? Because that's important. So that your children have that, support system from a young age of friends that are being raised similarly to them, have the same morals, have the same values, so that they have that support system as they get older and they start having friends that have a different moral system or value system, that they're not totally shaken by it, and that they're not totally just go off in any direction that's presented to them. No, they have their own friends, they have their own support system from a young age that's developed with them. So I think those are important things that we can do. Obviously, it's a very broad question. And there's a lot of angles to it, and society keeps changing all the time. So there's different, things that keep popping up. But I think those are very important places to start.
Thank you, Imam Hindi. These are very, very important points. I would add that I think as parents, sometimes we're afraid to communicate with our teens and even our preteens or our kids. And it's important. It's really important to have open conversations about our values and how other people have different values, and also educating ourselves about their world and their interests, so that you kind of have an in to their world to be able to understand what kind of other values are they getting, the values that are not kind of part of the house values or part of the, let's say, the religious school values. So it's really important, and it's not easy. It's not easy at all to have these conversations. And I could say I only recently came back to Saudi from Canada, and my son is only 6 years old. And at 6 years old, it was hard that I did have to talk about specific things that let's say living in Saudi, I wouldn't have had the same conversations at that specific age, because the exposure definitely in a Western world is very different than the exposure in a Muslim country or in the Arab world. And that's why I do understand how challenging it is. At the same time, the world is all one now, with social media, right? So even living on this side of the world, children are exposed to a lot of things that we wouldn't want them to be exposed to. And this is why I say it's very important for the parents to know what their kids are being exposed to. Trying as much as possible to know what kind of websites they go on to, what kind of pages on Instagram or Snapchat or TikTok do they access. Same thing with games, and I know with some games you can actually have conversations online and stuff like that. So really understanding their world, because their world is very different than our world and how we were raised. I don't know, Dr. Malik, if you have any other insights.
Yeah, no, I think that was the exact part that I was going. I was actually wondering around the question often that comes up is losing their values, right? And I often just ask parents, well, what are your values? What are the values that you're worried about losing? Are we talking about cultural values? Are we talking about dress code values? Are we talking about Islamic values? What values do you hold? And prioritizing those values. And I think Imam Hindi is touching upon this about, you model your values. Really, your kids understand what you value by knowing what you're spending time towards. So if you're coming home and turning on the TV and that's your way of relaxing and de-stressing, that's what the messages that you kind of show them as well. And so I do think important practices like dhikr together, even as family members, prayer together, encouraging the ways in which you relax and the ways in which you cope, and exposing your children to that are very important, because that's where they learn all of these tools from. The other thing that I was going to touch on is I love, understanding their world, because I think that's so important. And also it allows you to mentalize your children a lot better. And mentalizing what's happening for your kids is half of the game. Half of parenting is mentalizing what's happening for your kids. Because if you cannot understand their perspective and you cannot understand what things are like for them, you can't mentalize, and then you can't validate. And those are two really key important strategies for parenting. So those were kind of that's one of the big questions that came up. The second one is around, how do I help my adolescent not to wallow in self-pity? I think it's very hard to have them partake in activities to promote self-esteem and confidence, such as getting outside, family time, limiting screen time, vigor, etc.
That's a very good question, because adolescence is such a hard time for parents to manage. And I think in our talk, like we talked about how there has to be a balance between like control and responsibility, and how the teen is kind of in a state of trying to understand who they are and understand like what their place is in the world. So it's a very challenging time for them, and for the parents to know how to deal with them. And a lot of teens also during this time, like of adolescence, they have let's say self-image problems, they have self-esteem problems, they have challenges with things that happen socially, whether it's at school, online, at home. So as a parent, it's important to try to reach out to the adolescent, and again, try to
I think we might have lost her for a moment, because I can see
you, or can you still hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Yeah.
Okay. And
I've lost Dr.
Sorry, Arfine, I'm just gonna be back in a bit, just a sec, sorry.
No problem. I think one of the important things, though, that Dr. Alkoshki was touching on is that adolescence can be a really tough age, and communication with parents is so important. And I think this is foundational to what we're talking about today, is keeping the lines of communication is really important. But with an adolescent who may be a little attitudinally challenged with you and may make it hard for you to kind of sit in a room with them because they may not feel like it. They may give off signals that they don't want you around. And yet we know, because we talk to adolescents all day long, that's their job, they actually really want you there. They really want you to demonstrate that you care. And it actually means a lot to them when you check in. And a lot of parents, they pull back and they think, my adolescent doesn't want me there at all. And they start pulling back more and more. And they actually start to rely on services and other people for them to talk to. But in reality, like a lot of the times the kid wants to talk to you. It's just something so hard to talk about that they're not there yet. And sometimes they just want you to sit with them. And a lot of teens tell us this, they just want you to sit with them and watch a movie with them or something. Like just spend some time with them, not even talking to them, not grilling them on what they're experiencing, not asking them hard questions, but just spending some one-on-one time with them. And a lot of parents are surprised by that, because they think that was their baby time. Like their baby time was the one-on-one time, but actually in adolescence, they do value having that one-on-one time with you too. Sama, I think that, Dr. Alkoshki, I think that's what you're going to touch on.
Yes, and understanding like where that self-pity is also coming from, and then if, let's say, you find out that like it's affecting them in their relationships, it's affecting them in their functioning, they're not themselves, they're in a way that is really like, let's say they're always sad, they're always anxious, they're just ruminating on things, and it's not their usual, then it might be a red flag for them to be assessed by a mental health professional. And the other thing that I wanted to say, there is this really good book by Daniel Siegel. It's called Brainstorm. it's specific for adolescents, and how to understand the adolescent brain. And I highly recommend it for any parent that actually has a teenager. It's very good, and it's also good for the teen themselves to it's available in audio or in like in a book and on Amazon or anything, anywhere you want to buy it. But like, it really helps the youth understand what is happening in their brain during this very challenging time.
Imam Hindi, did you have more to add about that question?
No, I was actually very interested in your answers because I didn't really know how to deal with those types of questions. You know, there's something that people say as a hadith. It's not a hadith. Maybe some of the later generations said it, but that the idea of play with your children for 7 years and then discipline them for 7 years and then befriend them for 7 years. And so that last 7 years would be, you know, getting into that adolescent age. And I thought that was really interesting, the idea of just like befriend them and be around them. And I think a lot of adolescents, from teenagers and whatnot, from what I've seen, is that they don't like their parents around because their parents are always grilling them, right? Like, why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you studying? Why aren't you, right? And it's just a bunch of questions. And then, they might be already feeling bad about themselves. They might be already, feeling different emotions, and then they feel like you're just bringing stress on them. And so that creates even more friction between you and between your adolescent child. And so I thought that was great advice, to just be around them, just watch a movie, just sit with them, just read a book around them. You know what I mean? Like, what are you going to do? But just, find a way to just stay with them. And hopefully eventually, the ice breaks and they find a way to ask whatever question they want to ask, or feel a little bit of closeness. But it's really important to build that type of friendship where they feel open enough. I mean, you're still a parent, but at least open enough to have a conversation with you. And it's not just going to turn into a lecturing session, because that's definitely something that's going to turn them away from us.
Jazakallah khair, Imam Hindi, and Dr. Al-Kwashki. I think those are both really important points. I have my eye on the time, and we have to, us in Toronto, have to read our Maghrib Salah. I have one last question, but before I just get to the one last question quickly, I would be remiss if I didn't say that any talk on positive and prophetic parenting needs to just talk about the basics of parenting, are the basic values of parenting, right? And I really want to touch upon this because trauma is widespread in our community, abuse is widespread, and unfortunately, Sama and I, Dr. Al-Kwashki and I, we see this a lot working with Muslim children, where there's harsh discipline measures that are used at home with children. There's unfortunately, really challenging things that happen in the home. And I really do think that instilling Islamic values and positive parenting strategies is the place where everything starts for children. And it's the foundational element to anything. And so a lot of parents, they have their eye on the prize, is that their children becomes Hafiz al-Quran, or their children becomes a doctor or engineer or a lawyer, or any, a successful measure in this life, and or even in the akhirah. But the most important foundational element for that to happen for them, even in the akhirah, is them being able to have nurturing and responsive parenting that is warm, right? And the warmth often lacks. The discipline sometimes comes first and the warmth often lacks. And Dr. Al-Kwashki and I just really wanted to share that the message that we get from the evidence base, the message that I'm sure Imam Hindi would share as well with you, and has in his prophetic parenting podcast series on Yaqeen, is that actually the value is in the warmth. That when there's no warmth, there's no discipline. When there's no warmth, then they're not going to follow with what you're saying. And so having a warm, nurturing, and responsive attitude as a parent is kind of the hallmarks of good parenting at any age, really at any age. So I just wanted to touch on that piece. Imam Hindi or Dr. Al-Kwashki, do you have anything more to add about that piece?
No, thank you for adding that. It's extremely important.
Yeah, I agree completely. And actually, it's the foundation to your relationship with your child is for them to feel compassion, rahmah, between you and them. And I did mention this in the series, but the famous hadith we mention all the time, which is, whoever is not merciful to others, Allah will not be merciful to them. This came in the context of a parent with their child, right? So the concept of being merciful to others, and then Allah Azza wa Jalla will show us mercy, primarily is about our children, our relationship to our children, and that's something that absolutely we need to establish from day one.
Jazakallah khair for that. And so the last question that I had here is really not. Okay. It's around a child who I guess is feeling bad spiritually and feeling like they're not a good person, even if they're told that we all grow and we all get better. So any tips on that? So I guess it's about a child who's feeling bad spiritually about not feeling like a good person.
I mean, it would be really important to make sure that they don't have kind of an underlying mental health challenge, because like a lot of people who or children who experience that, let's say kind of either because of an underlying depression or due to thoughts like anxious thoughts, or due to an underlying kind of obsessive compulsive disorder picture. So it would be important to rule out something like that. But like, that would be kind of the second step. But like in the first step, I would say is just like, again, like just understanding where that is coming from for your child. Why are they feeling like a bad person? Have they been told that they are a bad person? Are they being bullied at school or online? Is there someone bothering them at home? Is there something kind of, are they exposed to any kind of abuse, whether it's physical or sexual or emotional? Just making sure that all of these kind of things are in check. And then if you feel like, again, if it's always when you feel like something is affecting their relationships and affecting their functioning, whether it's at school or at home, is when you would really want them to be assessed by a mental health professional. Dr. Malik, I'll give it back to you if you want to add anything.
No, I think Imam Hindi had some more to add with Jazakallah for those tips, Dr. Al-Kawashki, about red flags to really look out for in the situation.
Yeah. So it was interesting. You were thinking about the medical perspective. I was thinking about, what kind of Islam are they being taught, or have they been taught in the past? Sometimes it's very, very negative. Everything is, you didn't do this, therefore, you're going to hellfire. And for sure, we need to have as believers an element of fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and an awe of Him, but we also have to balance that out with hope and optimism, and realizing the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is great, and realizing that, to think that Allah will not forgive us is worse than any sin, because now we're limiting the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So having that very optimistic perspective and that understanding and that hopefulness in Allah's forgiveness is really important. And, the idea of like the way that we talk, I mean, it's a very large topic, but the way that we talk about shame in an Islamic perspective sometimes is very flawed, right? We should have hayat, we should have modesty towards Allah Azza wa Jal, but more from the perspective of He gave us all of this. Shouldn't we feel modest that we're not trying to live up to our end of our covenant with Allah Azza wa Jal, rather than, you should feel bad about yourself because you've done this, and kind of inviting very negative self-talk, telling ourselves that we're the worst and things like that. And that's really the way of shaitan. Shaitan whispers in our ears, and part of the whispering of shaitan is that you're the worst, you're this, you're that. So we don't want to help shaitan do what he's trying to do to us to begin with by saying negative things about ourselves. But I think those are broader questions. What kind of Islam are they being exposed to? Can we, expose them to more positive understandings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, realizing the mercy of Allah, leaning into that area, especially if they're feeling a lot of, a great deal of negativity about themselves. And then, trying to encourage your child to praise them when you can, to increase their self-esteem, to encourage them, like instead of saying, I'm such a bad Muslim, I missed a prayer, to think things like, inshallah, I'm going to be a better Muslim by making more prayers, right? Like just changing that dynamic where, you're thinking more positively about things. So I think that's where my advice would come from, and reminding them that Allah Azza wa Jal honors them and He loves them, and having that perspective, I think is going to be very important, inshallah.
Jazakallah khair for both of you. Had such a balanced approach to it from both the spiritual and mental health angle. So that was really nice to see. And I think, you know, similarly to what we've touched on already, just the modeling of parents. Again, you know, it may be that this message comes from the way that you as a parent may demonstrate yourself not feeling good in some way, or how you kind of cope with things as well. So I know, you know, one of the important things that I often hear about from parents is they don't share with their child how they cope, right? Or they don't share with their child about how they themselves sometimes do feel bad spiritually, and what they do to help cope when they feel that way. And so again, just circling back to that piece of really the way your children are going to know how to cope, the way that they're going to know how to deal with big emotions is when you actually tell them and you show them how you're coping and what you're doing. Okay. So Jazakallah, I know us here in Toronto, we have to run, but I wanted to say a big thank you to everybody who participated in the webinar, for everybody who sent in their questions. And if you haven't already, please do check out our parenting tools on YouTube. That's recorded by Dr. Al-Kwashki and myself. That gives you some positive parenting tips that are very practical and can be used really easily. And it combines just positive parenting strategies with some of our understanding of, you know, prophetic ways of parenting. And also, please do check out Imam Hindi's amazing prophetic parenting podcast by Yaqeen, which is available on lots of podcast platforms and on YouTube and lots of different areas. Please do check out these two resources. They're extremely important for parents to be able to have right now. And they really balance the evidence base with the spiritual lens. So Jazakallah khair. And we will post the link. We've posted the link here in the chat as well for you to click on if you had time today, if all the kids are in bed. And inshallah, we will come to you again with some more programs on parenting workshops soon. Jazakallah khair, everyone, for joining.